a seasonal park means that Cedar Point is only able to be open during the summer. With thousands of people all walking around outdoors, the heat and weather become a real pain point for many people. And I think Cedar Point needs to address this problem, and they can do it by looking indoors. I'm a firm believer in variety is what makes a good park. A well-designed park needs to have something for everyone, and something for every occasion, and something for every scenario. And at the intro I mentioned the weather being a factor to consider, and that's something I want to focus on today. Have you ever been at Cedar Point when it begins to rain? I mean, I certainly have, and here's what it looks like. The park totally empties. And actually, the day I wrote this portion of the script, my dad went to Cedar Point after a rain, and he said it was a ghost town. Pretty much everyone leaves the park if it starts raining, and only a fraction, maybe 1/10 of the people stick around. So why does this happen? After the rain begins, many of the park's coasters and rides are forced to stop for safety reasons. Most of them can run in a small sprinkle, but many can't run in high rain or wind. And when I say many, I mean practically all of them. So imagine what happens to the park when the weather comes in. Every ride closes down and the guests are left with only two choices. Either duck into a shop and wait out the storm, or leave the park and go find something else to do. If the weather is only planned to last a few minutes, it's common for people just to wait it out. But if it's gonna rain for any particularly long amount of time, usually that means that it kills attendance to the park for the rest of the day. It also gets extremely hot in the summer. I mean, this summer on the lake, we spent most of the days in the high 80s with a handful of days in the high 90s. And this may not be unbearably hot, but it's definitely uncomfortably hot. And this heat can become such an issue because it causes irritability, headaches, nausea, and other things that'll make people want to leave the park. And the issue here is that there are actually very few ways to escape the heat. I mean, first of all, there isn't much shade in the park. I mean, there are some trees, but the park is actually so full of rides that it makes finding tree shade quite difficult. I mean, you can duck into some of the restaurants for maybe a minute, but since Cedar Point has such a heavy focus on quick service food in the parks, there's only 3 places in the park that you can eat indoors. I mean, you can duck into the theater, Red Garter Saloon or Lusky Lil's for a show, if they're going on, and you can duck into some shops. And that's about it. And guess what? It's a seasonal park for a reason. That's because it also gets cold here too. I mean, imagine all the problems we just explained with the heat, but in reverse for the cold. When the cold rolls in, attendance drops dramatically because you're stuck mostly outside on a cold, windy lake. There are very few places to duck into to warm up, especially because they don't do as many shows in the colder part of the season. That means you can't always hang out in the theaters. All of this is to illustrate the problem. Cedar Point's incredibly reliant on the weather. They're so reliant on the weather that it already shuts down their whole park for half the year. So this means that every single day they lose park attendance to the weather is a day that money was taken out of their pocket. But here's the thing, the money doesn't necessarily have to be taken out of their pocket. It is possible to keep some guests in the park during the rainy, the hot, and the cold days. But the reason they struggle to do it is because some serious holes in the park's design. In fact, I actually think this was pretty well illustrated by a comment I received on another video that I want to read here. I apologize if I butcher the name of the park. I know it's not from the good old US of A, but here we go. Efteling has just one water ride, and that park attracts almost 6 million visitors a year. Also, it's together with the indoor dark rides because of the shade, and it's the most popular ride on hot summer days. Would Cedar Point benefit from a good, large, people-eating dark ride? Yep, dark rides. And Efteling is not the only example to draw from here. Let's look at 2 of my favorite examples to draw notes from, and that's Disney World and Universal Orlando. These parks share 2 of the weather patterns with Cedar Point in that they are constantly very hot and very wet. It rains almost daily in Orlando, and yet the parks don't see a hit to their attendance. A huge part of the key to that, for me, is an array of things to do that don't involve being directly out in the weather. Also at my other home park, Kings Island, along with its Paramount brethren, had Boo Blasters on Boo Hill, which, if I actually had to take a guess, I would say is my most ridden ride ever. I mean, it's one that my wife and I ride literally almost every single time we've ever been to Kings Island. It's perfect because you can escape the heat, you can escape the cold, it's easy to get in and out of, you can take a kid, and anything else that you can think of. Cedar Point has a library of exactly 0 indoor rides in the entire park. In fact, Their entire collection of indoor anything is basically non-existent. And there's a few things to be said about indoor rides, but here's some of the facts about dark rides. First is that they can give a very easy and obvious solution to bad weather. Everyone can crowd into them and cool off or wait out the weather. The second is that their throughput for guests can be massive in comparison to coasters. The third is that they're very friendly to guests of all ages. These reasons are the exact reasons why you see them in parks like Disney so much. When you're trying to come up with attractions to eat people, as the commenter put it, dark rides are the obvious choice. And if Cedar Point wants to grow, finding high throughput attractions that they can build alongside their lower throughput ones becomes an obvious choice to make. So why hasn't Cedar Point done that in decades? The answer, of course, is obvious. It's cost. A quality dark ride can cost just as much to build as a coaster, and while the benefits of having a few dark rides in the park are excellent, the problem with them is that Cedar Point has developed a reputation as a park for coasters. And this means that anything that's not a coaster will lack the marketability that's actually going to sell tickets. But that said, it becomes really hard to justify that cost when you know that building a new coaster will immediately result in an uptick in ticket sales, while a dark ride probably won't. But I think this is a mistake, and I think Cedar Point knows this is a mistake. And I think they're doing a lot to work on their brand to change this image, to make it an option in the future. And this is actually a way larger dilemma I want to talk about in a future video, so stay tuned for that. But let's look at a future in which this does become a financially sensible decision for them to do. What could they do? The really hard part about this is finding space in the park to build a dark ride. I mean, the fact is, these buildings take up massive amounts of space, and for them to work, you really need to be clever about the ride location and layout to mask this massive building. So to me, there's a couple options that exist with the current park layout that I think could make sense. The first location is actually right near the front of the park, and that is the location of the current picnic pavilion. I've said in previous videos that this location used to be used a lot, but nowadays I see it used significantly less than in the past. And it takes up a considerable amount of footprint. I mean, also directly next to this area between the drink stand and the French Quarter is an empty area where there used to be an entrance to a haunted house years ago, but now it seems that area isn't being used for anything. So this entire area sits off of the midway, mostly out of sight of guests, and meaning that it could make an excellent spot to put a dark ride. So if they did that, I think the queue for it could be right near the entrance of the park, where the queue for the haunted house used to be, and the exit could be where the current pavilion entrance is, in between Hugo's and the theater. The second location is not very far away from here either, and across the midway at what used to be Johnny Rockets and is now an arcade. Johnny Rockets could be the entrance to the ride, and the ride building could be built into the employee parking and storage area behind these building structures. For this to work, there would need to be a reconfiguration of some areas to move that storage building as well as make space for the employee entrance to the park, as those are both used extremely frequently. However, I don't at all think that it's impossible to keep the storage building by rotating it and placing it down onto the south side of this area while keeping the drive mostly in its current location. The parking could be moved just by removing a handful of parking spots from the beach parking area and making that the employee parking. And I think the ride could dump people out into the plaza by Gatekeeper, an area that currently feels like it's a little bit of a dead zone due to Gatekeeper being the only attraction in that plaza. Personally, I really like this one as it makes so much better use of the Johnny Rockets space than the arcade does, while also not really sacrificing all that much in the process. The third location is actually the one that I don't think they could make work, but actually one that if they did would be an excellent location in my eyes, and that's the current location of the Midway Arcade. This location has a perfect entrance right off of the main Midway, and it could dump people into Planet Snoopy at the end. The building for the arcade is already huge, and there are very spacious areas in the back of the arcade that are completely underutilized. There's two main reasons I don't think this is a very doable area though. First is that it's currently the main arcade, and I think this could be solved in this situation by just moving all the arcade equipment over to the aforementioned Funway Arcade and making that area the main arcade. The second is that the structure of the building means that there are 2 floors and a ton of support pillars. The second floor is used for employees, meaning that the building would require significant structural changes as well as the reconfigurations of where the employees will go once their HQ becomes a ride. The fourth area they could add a dark ride is another already existing structure, and that's the other pavilion, the Lakeside Pavilion. This is another one that I don't see used particularly often, and while this area is a lot more built up than the other pavilion, I don't think that puts it out of the realm of options when it comes to renovation. Especially since it already has a very stately historical building off of the boardwalk that they could turn into the ride entrance, and with the ride exit being in the same area. I mean, to me, this would probably be the spot that makes the least financial sense for Cedar Point to do. What makes the most sense from a park design standpoint is the layout is nearly perfect for a dark ride. For this dark ride, what would the theme and story be? Whatever the story is, I think that Cedar Point should be looking into developing a real sense of a consistent theme and story throughout the different areas of the park. So I'm gonna think about this from the point of view of trying to fit into the greater sense of theme of the Midway area or the boardwalk. I don't claim to be an expert of coming up with these stories or anything else for that matter, but let's just throw some stuff at the wall anyway. When Steel Vengeance was launching, Cedar Point put together a little bit of lore about Maverick and Steel Vengeance. And what if they turned that into a dark ride with a bit of a cowboy theme? Well, I think this could be a compelling story. I think theming doesn't quite fit with the location. I think the Johnny Rockets location had a kind of 60s early rock and roll feel that could play well into something musically themed. Maybe a ride where you have to shoot music notes as you go and the ride keeps score. The locations at the Lakeside Pavilion could play directly into the boardwalk's theme by being themed around the Hotel Breakers, or maybe it's a haunted hotel? Or they could always play along with Snoopy and do a storyline of some Charlie Brown cartoons in ride form. Dark rides can have a ridership ranging from anywhere from 800, such as on Blue Blasters, to 2,000 guests on an hour on rides like Dream Flight and The Little Mermaid. I mean, this is on par with ridership present on coasters, making them a great place to huddle guests in and out. But there's more than one way to please a large number of people indoors, so what are the other options out there? The Good Time Theater was groundbreaking when it was built. But more than that, at 900 seats, it was also an incredible way to gather large amounts of people and field them for a short period of time. I mean, there's definitely something to be said about large-scale shows like that. And now, when Good Time Theater was demolished, it isn't like the park wasn't left without shows to entertain. The theater near the entrance has shows, as well as the stage by Millennium, and more recently there's been shows over along the boardwalk. However, I would be remiss if I were to say that these were the same thing. Really, they aren't. Those shows require a large cast and crew to put on and typically only run part-time because of that. The venues are also way smaller. Now, switching gears slightly, I would also like to remember for a moment something in my past that's coming to me.
Are you ready, kids?
Aye, aye, Captain!
I can't hear you!
Aye, aye, Captain!
Good! In you go!
SpongeBob SquarePants 4D debuted in 2003 in both Kings Island as well as the other Paramount parks and Mall of America. I have vivid memories of literally going to this ride 5 or 6 times in a single day. I was obsessed with it. It's not the only 4D theater experience out there either. I mean, the ride is only 5 minutes, but it was a great 5 minutes, and there's countless other 4D experiences like it. So why not consider that as an option as well? I think we could even keep the name Good Time Theater as a callback to the original and develop a new 4D theater experience. With 400 to 500 seats and a decent show length of like 15 minutes, I think this could be a great, unique experience to suck people off the Midway and entertain them. Another option is more indoor dining. There's the Grand Pavilion on the boardwalk, there's Hugo's near the entrance, there's Chicky and Pete's over by Blue Streak, and technically you can eat inside coasters, but there's hardly any actual seating inside, so I don't really count it. With more dining options where people can actually eat indoors, it's another way to get people out of the weather and inside. An attitude I think they could actually take here is potentially a multi-faceted approach where they develop a large indoor structure that can combine indoor dining, a theater or ride, and a shop all together. The Land Pavilion at Epcot is what immediately comes to mind here. I think that they could take this a step further even by having a large-scale cafeteria indoors, like a kind of food hall. I think this could be great as a buffet area as well during special events, such as if they introduced a version of Winterfest, for example. There's plenty more they could do here as well, such as indoor mazes, character meeting spots, and more that they could add to the park in order to flesh out a more well-rounded park layout, all without ever needing to affect any coaster locations. I think that this is the one step that could result in a massive shift for the parks to be able to weather the changes in the weather, as well as their ability to handle a lot more in the number of guests visiting the park, which, if Cedar Point wants to grow, and I'm sure they'd like to, that will need to be a priority. So, that's it. What do you think? Does Cedar Point need a dark ride? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that you are beautifully and wonderfully made, and you are loved. That's the whole point. See you next time.